he's a lead of Talos Outreach EMEA. He's a technical lead of security research of that team, and this group is Talos is a part of Cisco company, and specifically team is working on representing threat intelligence and research organization. Martin, please.
That's right. Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everybody. I shall speak in English, so I hope this is nice and clear. I should start first by saying "Privyet." Is that right? Good, good. Very relieved. He taught me the good word. Thank you, Volodymyr. So we're quite correct. Talos is the threat intelligence and security research arm of Cisco. So we're all fully Cisco employees, but we like to think of ourselves as being slightly different and being our own separate organization within Cisco. I'm one of the technical leads of security research within the team and also the manager of the Talos outreach team within EMEA. What we do within Talos is try and understand the threat environment. We ask our customers within Cisco to share telemetry with us. I will emphasize it's entirely voluntary, it is entirely opt-in, it is also entirely anonymous. But we have enormous amounts of information about the malicious activity which is happening on the internet. 16 billion blocked web requests per day, so attempts to download malware over a web connection. We have 600 billion emails that we can analyze to see whether they're spam or whether they're carrying associated malware or phishing attacks. And we also have 3.4 billion malware queries per day, which leads us to collect 1.5 million unique pieces of malware each day. Our role is to try and make sense of this, primarily to identify the latest attacks that are out there so that we can block them and that we can protect Cisco's customers, but also to try and understand what the bad guys are up to. What are their goals? What are they trying to achieve? For myself, threat intelligence is as much about collecting indicators of compromise and new pieces of malware and understanding how the malware works, as much that as trying to predict what it is that the bad guys are doing. What are their models? What are they trying to achieve? And with this kind of understanding, we can start predicting what they might do next, or at the very least, understand how their business or criminal models work so that we can disrupt that and that we can try and take some of their activity down. So the first thing that I'd like you to think about, and if there's only one thing that you remember from this talk, I hope this will be it. There is no such thing as a new crime. What we're seeing in cybercriminality at the moment are traditional criminal business models that are being updated for the 21st century. So we can take a traditional crime, such as theft. It's an ancient crime, you know, it's been happening since the dawn of time. Here we got a medieval picture of a theft. We've got this individual on the left stealing the purse from the woman who's distracted by the conjurer on the right. We can look at this from a 21st century point of view and think, actually, this is a really, really inefficient form of theft, right? If you were doing this as a business, this really is not the way to do it. Why? This guy can only steal one purse at a time, right? He's limited. He can only steal the wallets for the people that are next to him. You know, it's really geographically limited. If I was to try and steal someone's purse now, there's no one who I can reach, right? This isn't working. Also, his gain is limited to the contents of that purse. This is a very, very inefficient way of stealing money. If we think about this and update it for the 21st century, right, where's the value in our businesses, and I'd hazard a guess in our daily lives, is all contained on computers. Right? This is where the business happens. This is how you're accessing your bank account. This is where your savings are. This is where what's valuable to you is. So we can update theft for the 21st century to go after computers. The great thing about malware is that once I get malware on a device, that device belongs to the person who wrote the malware. So I can actually steal what is important on the computer without physically stealing it. Again, physically stealing things is limited. I can only carry so much. I can only be in one place at one time. But if I distribute malware and I get my malware on this device, it then belongs to me. So I can steal what's really valuable from this machine. I can steal the CPU cycles and use them to do whatever interests me, such as mine bitcoins, maybe crack cryptography, do whatever form of cracking I want, because that computer belongs to me, and I do this for free because someone else is paying the electricity bill and paid for the computer. I can steal the bandwidth. Again, the person who thinks that they own that computer is paying the internet bill. So I can steal that internet connection, use it to send spam, which is still a very profitable activity. Even better, use it to send denial of service attacks. And all a denial of service attack is it's the 21st century version of the old-fashioned extortion racket, where your local gangster would knock on the door of the local businesses and demand money, or else he'd burn down or threaten to burn down the business. Again, it's very inefficient. You can only do one business at a time. Wonder of the denial of service attack, as the businesses move online, we can send them an email to say, wouldn't it be a shame if your website was to go offline for a month? Pay me some money and it might not happen. Suddenly, I can take this gangster extortion racket model and expand it to the entire world. It's a wonderful way of building in efficiencies into criminal activity. And we can do it by compromising machines and by stealing that bandwidth. We can also steal the data, steal that information which is held on the computer. So we can steal credentials, usernames, passwords, use that to do old-fashioned theft, get into your bank account, get into your financial systems, steal money that way. Much, much more efficient than stealing wallets. We can do old-fashioned fraud of identity theft and pretend to be you. Or we can try and steal other information that you've got on here. If we're going to steal other information and make money for it, well, typically we need to find someone who's going to buy that information, which isn't necessarily easy. A very good example that I've got is this PowerPoint presentation. There is no second-hand market, criminal underground market for PowerPoint presentations. Okay? Nobody is going to pay for this presentation. But it is very, very valuable to me. Because if I'd switched on this laptop this morning and it had said that that PowerPoint presentation wasn't there and that I had to stand in front of you and talk for 45 minutes, an hour without any slides, I would feel really, really stupid. Right? So for the criminals, this is an opportunity. So what we can do is take another very old-fashioned business model and update it for the 21st century. Instead of stealing the data and trying to sell it to a third party, we can kidnap it. Old-fashioned kidnap. Take that data and hold it to ransom, and only offer it back to you if you will pay the ransom note. And this is ransomware. So increasingly, we see the bad guys adopting this model as a new way of making money. Getting malware onto PCs, getting that PC to do the bidding of the malware controller is something that criminals have been doing for a long time now. Adapting that to, instead of stealing data and trying to sell it, a little bit old-fashioned, maybe not quite so profitable, but holding that data to ransom and kidnapping it, taking a traditional criminal business model that we know how it works, adapting it for the 21st century. So the first thing I want to do is take you through a little bit of the history of ransomware and how it's developed. And again, with seeing the trends within that, we can start predicting stuff for the future. The very first example of ransomware that we can identify dates from the tail end of the 1980s. It was written by an individual who was a researcher, and it was distributed to the medical community as a program to help physicians identify whether someone had AIDS or was going to develop AIDS. If you didn't pay for the program at first go, what actually happened was that this ransom note would pop up on your PC. The program behind the scenes actually encrypted the file names of the files on your computer, and it demanded that you pay $189 by a money order being sent to a physical address in Panama. So, I think understandably, this was not written by a criminal genius. Because he wants a money order, we have a way of tracing the money to see where that ends up. And even easier, we've got a physical address, so we can actually just sit and wait to see who goes to the post office box and collects the money orders that have been sent there. Indeed, the gentleman who wrote the ransomware was soon identified, was actually brought to court for prosecution, where he was found actually unfit to stand trial due to insanity. So our first example of ransomware was actually written by an insane criminal. Just like in Batman, we have a genuine insane criminal inventing a new form of doing crime. We didn't see any more ransomware until 2005, where we see the very first example of what we'd recognize as modern ransomware. Distributed over email, we'd get a very modern looking wallpaper on your desktop demanding a ransom, and in the background it's encrypted the files. Actually, the very first versions of the encryption that it was using were symmetric, so that we could identify the decryption key within the malware. As that went on, they actually moved to a much, much more secure asymmetric form of encryption. We started seeing more forms of ransomware through the tail end of the years 2000, and still we get to about 2010, 2011, where really ransomware starts taking off, and we see a whole range of different families evolving. Key things to notice: the encryption changes over time. The first versions actually often had weaknesses in the encryption, or the decryption key was distributed by the malware itself so that we can actually break the encryption and find ways of decrypting the files without paying the ransom. Over time, the encryption has actually increased in efficiency and increased in security, so it's becoming increasingly difficult to find vulnerabilities within the encryption routines that we can exploit ourselves in order to write decryptors for the malware. Other things to notice: well, one, the ransom increases over time. Early versions often used digital currencies, Liberty Resolve or Ucash or eGold, which were currencies that were used over the internet. That gave the ransomware a single point of failure, and as many of these electronic currencies were raided by law enforcement and shut down and taken off the internet, that became less efficient for the ransomware writers, and so increasingly they've moved to Bitcoin. We spent an awful lot of time trying to follow the money through Bitcoins. We can find the Bitcoin wallets that often are used within the ransomware, and often we can see that first hop of money going into the Bitcoin wallet. After that, that wallet goes into some form of Bitcoin aggregator, either an exchange or an online gambling environment or something such as that, for which we see lots of sums of money coming out, but we can't trace the money forwards. We know we're not the only people investigating Bitcoin and looking and trying to follow the money, and as far as we can tell, Bitcoin really is 100% secure at the moment. There is no way of actually following the money into the end wallet where it ends up. Hence, it's a very, very good way of laundering your money if you're going to distribute ransomware. Another key thing that's happening over time, and I'll talk about this in more detail in a moment, we get to the beginning of this year and we start seeing ransomware which is actually encrypting servers rather than just endpoints, which is quite a significant shift. We'll talk about that in a moment. We go out and we collect the various forms of ransomware, and in fact it's quite interesting if you think about the ransomware ecosystem. The bet that you're making when or if you pay a ransom in ransomware is that the bad guys will actually decrypt your files. If you think about it from the bad guys' point of view, well, really their business ends the minute that you pay the ransom. They are under no obligation to actually decrypt your files. If they don't, who are you going to complain to? Right? What are you going to do? You're not going to phone them up and say your ransomware doesn't work. No, they'll laugh at you. So we actually find parasitic ransomware that's pretending to be ransomware, but in fact isn't ransomware at all. This particular variant we call Ranscam. To all intents and purposes, it really looks like normal ransomware. If it infects your endpoint, we get a ransom note. Looks very, very similar to any other. If we look at it, there's a couple of things which are interesting. It says your files have been moved to a hidden partition and encrypted. Well, that's kind of unusual. Why would you move files to a hidden partition and then encrypt them? Doesn't quite make sense. If we look behind the scenes at what this ransomware in inverted commas really does, in fact, if you try and pay, it'll bring up this image saying that your payment has not been verified and that they'll delete one file. In fact, it doesn't matter what you type in, you will always get this image that your payment has not been verified. And behind the scenes, well, let's face it, writing cryptography and secure cryptographic libraries is kind of difficult, right? It involves maths, it's difficult to get it right. Far, far easier just to delete the files. So all this ransomware does is actually just runs through your file system, merrily deleting files. As far as the end user is concerned, from what they see the ransom note, they try and pay. The payment will never be successful. They will never get their files back because they've just been deleted. Far easier to write, but interestingly, it only works if you actually believe that you're going to get your files back in ransomware. So in terms of an ecosystem, this is really quite interesting. If too much ransomware just deletes your files, then no one will ever pay the ransom, and hence it's no longer a viable criminal business. But yeah, if enough people believe that ransomware actually works, and indeed enough of the criminals do decrypt your files if you pay, then this kind of activity, which is masquerading as ransomware, actually works. However, it's kind of difficult doing operational security if you're a bad guy. And in fact, what we were able to find with this particular ransomware is quite a lot of similarity with two other ransomware variants that were in circulation at the same time. So we've got the ran scam with that key phrase hidden partition. We've also got SAW, which was in distribution at the same time. It's got a similar model in that you try and pay, but if you don't pay, it threatens to delete your files. So actually that's quite unusual that a piece of ransomware will overtly claim to try and delete your files. And we've also got this one, AnonPop, which again is a form of ransomware, which has also got this key phrase, your computer files have been crypted and moved to a hidden encrypted partition. Right, do you remember that phrase? It's kind of similar. We've seen that before. If we look at how these malware are distributed, again, we find some similarities. If we look at the domains that Ranscam was distributed over, we find this one, Waldorf Trust, which is similar, which is actually used to also distribute Jigsaw. Okay, so we've got a link now between these two pieces of malware. Also that third one, AnonPop, again, we've got this domain which is being used to distribute it, the same one as Jigsaw. So we've got a link now between these two pieces of malware and also this other domain. If we look in a little bit more detail and look at how these domains were registered, we find 3 email addresses. We also find that these 2 domains have been transferred from cryptofinancial at yandex.com to mineaccount at yandex.com. And we can also find this other domain, cryptoconsulate.com, which was registered to mineaccount2 at yandex.com. Kind of similar, right? So we've got clear associations between this address and this one because the domains were used to transfer it. And then we've got this very, very similar domain that we can also find. If we Google for mine account, which is used in 2 of these domains, we can actually find the profile of this individual who's active on underground forums and who writes to congratulate someone who's written a .NET obfuscation piece of software, which is kind of interesting because our 3 variants of malware were written in .NET and were clearly obfuscated. And we can also find in 2 of them artifacts within the compilation of the malware that shows that it was done by the same person. So all of a sudden, we can actually associate this activity with at least a username, an individual who we know is active on the underground forums. Difficult to go any further. So, of course, like any researcher or programmer, what do you do when you get a little bit frustrated or you find a little bit of a slow moment in your day? Well, of course, you go and browse Reddit, like everyone does. What do we find on Reddit? Well, we actually find this particular individual, Crypto Consulate, who's the moderator of Crypto Wall Removal, and cryptowallremoval.com was actually registered by mine account at yandex.com. So we've got kind of an association there. What Crypto Consulate does is he's been active on Bitcoin mining subreddits on Reddit, offering this wonderful piece of software that'll mine Bitcoins for free on your PC if you download it. What do you think actually happens? You guessed it, it's ransomware. Interestingly, this was actually ransomware that we hadn't identified before. So by following through and doing this sort of old-fashioned threat intelligence and threat research of looking for indicators of compromise and indicators of an individual behind it, tracing their activity, tracing what they're actually doing, tracing their activity on forums, we can actually go in and find fairly rare pieces of ransomware and just go out and, of course, write the detection for that, for making sure that it's blocked. So it's quite interesting, and it shows that often the bad guys aren't that good at doing operational security, or at least it's very, very hard to do operational security well. Of course, there's many different ways of distributing ransomware. One of the very easiest is to use email. You know, there are only also, I think if I remember correctly, about 75,000 CVE vulnerabilities that have been identified in the history of the CVE project. It is far, far easier just to try and exploit that human vulnerabilities. And instead of doing anything complicated or trying to write exploits to compromise a PC, it's far, far easier to write somebody an email and say, please would you click here to install this piece of ransomware. In fact, the social engineering behind these types of emails is often quite interesting. In this particular campaign, the to address was correct. It was actually the, they were getting the username based from the to address that they were sending it to. So we've got already the correct salutation to refer to someone, which is increasing the legitimacy of the email. We've also got a correct term for the person within the organization who might be in authority. As human beings, we're programmed to follow authority. And here we go, we've got our ransomware at the bottom. Of course, as security professionals, we tell our users never to click on unexpected emails, never to click the link. It's quite interesting. Within Cisco, our CISO has a program to send out messages such as these to the entire organization that look kind of similar to that. They don't contain malware. They actually take you to a page that tells you not to be so stupid, don't click on links and follow the mandatory training. Our CISO is very, very proud that throughout Cisco, the security group, of which I'm a member, has the lowest rate of click-through in the entire organization, which is still 1%. And I very embarrassingly have to put my hand up to say I'm one of the 1%. It is all the more embarrassing because I started my career writing spam filters. For many, many years, my job was analyzing emails such as this, looking for those little telltale signs that give away the fact that an email is not legitimate. But I still fell for it, which is really interesting. Again, in my defense, I will say it wasn't my fault. What had actually happened was I'd logged a ticket with HR because I had a question about expenses and what expenses could I legitimately claim and get my money back. So I get a reply from someone who I've never heard of course, they're in HR, saying, we will look at your query and we'll get back to you in a few days. So of course, in a few days' time, when I get an email from someone who I've never heard of with a title saying your financial information that says, dear Martin, please click here to find out that financial information that you requested. For me, it wasn't an unexpected email. I was expecting it. So of course, I click the link, and up comes a page to say, Martin Lee, don't be so stupid. You should know better. Please click here to retake your mandatory retraining in threats. And I felt incredibly embarrassed. but I learned a lesson. And the thing is, these kind of emails work when someone is actually expecting something. And they work through coincidence. That you may think that your users, because you've told them so many times, wouldn't click on an unexpected email. But if that email is not unexpected to them, then yes, people will click. And so always, I think this is going to be a very, very effective way of distributing malware. The ways that these are distributed is also changing. We're increasingly seeing very, very heavy bursts of spam being sent in a very, very narrow time frame. The reason for that, of course, when you're writing or updating anti-spam systems, there's always a little bit of time before you signature an email and then update that signature and then get it distributed to your spam systems. I think the bad guys are aware of that, and they're aware that if they send out very high volumes of spam in a very short period of time, then they're maximizing the probability of those emails getting into the end box of an end user, where somebody is going to be expecting an email such as that and is going to risk on clicking it. Of course, this particular Zepto ransomware was very, very clearly ransomware. It's downloading from its command and control infrastructure a subsequent payload, both via domains. We can identify the domains, we can block it. Also from IP addresses, again, if we've got the IP address or we've even got a bad reputation for that IP address, we can block it. The fact that this executable changes the wallpaper and displays a decoy image is very, very indicative of ransomware. So a lot of our work within the Talos group is actually looking at families of ransomware and trying to identify indicators of how malware works. That way, when we find a completely unknown piece of malware for which we don't have a hash, because we've got lots of these little tests that we can ask of the program, we can still identify that it's malicious simply because it's behaving like ransomware, even if it's something that we haven't seen before. Another way that the bad guys have adopted for distributing ransomware is actually through advertising. If you think about it, if you're a small business and you want people to go to your website, what is more effective than actually using adverts? Exactly the same thing happens for the bad guys. Most websites these days are supported through advertising. Underneath this, we've got a whole infrastructure that is choosing what advert it's going to display to a user who visits the website, possibly on their profile, possibly about where they're located. If you're lucky, you go to the website, it'll choose an advert which is relevant to your interests and display that. If you're unlucky, you can go to the same website, an entirely legitimate website, maybe related to your work or something that you go to every day. And somewhere along the lines, if not the main ad server, then maybe one of the partners or even one of the partners of partners, someone along the line, somebody has either got compromised or quite simply the bad guy has bought advertising space, at which point the same advert will bounce you on to an exploit kit landing page that goes through and looks what plugins you've got on your browser to see if anything that you've got is unpatched, and if it finds something that you're vulnerable for, will upload the malware and compromise your device. This becomes all the more complicated because if we look at the way that we're building websites these days, there are so many different components that are being brought in. So this is what happens if you go to CNN.com. You don't just get the content from CNN.com, you get all this other content which is being pulled in there. So there's that light JavaScript library that your web designer absolutely had to include. You've got adverts, of course. You've got the image server. You've got clickbait. You've got all sorts of things being pulled in to create this page. So a single website, entirely legitimate one, is actually composed of 557 different connections taken from 39 different servers. So if we think about it from a bad guy's point of view, any one of these servers can be compromised and any one can be used to serve up malicious content. What that content looks like is something very, very similar to this. So we've just got a little bit of HTML code forwarding you on to this, which is the exploit kit server. And this iframe is actually located minus 500 pixels to the left and minus 500 pixels below the screen. So if that's your screen, your iframe is somewhere over here. You will never see it. It will not be visible in your browser. It'll bounce you on to the exploit kit landing page, which is entirely invisible to your end user. Now, what this actually looks like is this. So this is a video of a genuinely compromised website when it was hosting a malicious advert which bounced you onto an exploit kit. Now, you're all security professionals. What I'd like you to do is actually watch, if I can get this to play, here we go. Watch very, very carefully at what happens. So we've got an entirely legitimate website. We go on to the obituary page just to see who's died. And I want you to watch really, really carefully. Really carefully. Did you notice it? You noticed, right? It said not responding for about a second. That not responding, in the background, there was a malicious advert. It's gone on to an exploit kit landing page. It sniffed the browser, looked for an unpatched plugin, triggered an exploit, uploaded the ransomware, and the first thing you know about it is when the ransom note pops up. So there we go. In the background, all of our files have now been encrypted. All of that data is now gone, whether that's photographs of your children or indeed anything that you've worked on has all been encrypted, and it was completely invisible to the end user. I mean, this is an absolutely beautiful way of distributing malware. You don't even have to click on a link that you shouldn't click on. Browsing something, browsing a news website or anything related to your work, if we can exploit the advertising system or any of those servers involved in building the web page, we can upload the malware entirely invisible to the end user. Once you've done that, it's too late. You're encrypted. Beautiful system. We identified one particular campaign that was being used to distribute ransomware through a single exploit kit. And we could actually identify that one particular service provider was hosting quite a lot of these exploit kits. Although the bad guys were very careful to cycle over different IP addresses to host their exploit kits, over time we could build up a pattern and we could see that preferentially they were going to one particular service provider to host their content. Being Cisco, we reached out to the service provider and say, hey, we've noticed something's up. Can we help you with this? The service provider was actually very, very happy to hear from us. They knew that they were being abused by bad guys, but didn't have the resources in-house to investigate it in detail. We lent them some of our researchers, and in the process, we got the bad guys' logs. So what we were actually seeing in our telemetry were people being forwarded onto a proxy server. This was the config of the proxy server. Anyone who visited the proxy server was being bounced on to this IP address that actually held the exploit kits that were actually being served up to the visitors. So brilliant. We've now got an IP address that we can block and that we can take out this campaign. But a couple of other things to notice. There was this magic value that you could request from the proxy server that would return a 204 error. We think that this was used by the bad guys to monitor the uptime of their proxy servers, to actually understand what parts of their infrastructure were still alive. Very interestingly, there was this other magic value that you could request that would give you the logs. So these guys had actually built a very, very effective system for maintaining and gathering their logs, which if you work in network engineering is actually quite a difficult thing to do. Because they were doing their log management so well, and we'd managed to infiltrate their systems, we could actually look at how effective their systems were. They were targeting 90,000 individuals per day. Of those views, 9,000 were actually being effective and were being served up exploits. 40% of those exploits were actually successful. And 62% of these 40% who were being exploited were being served up ransomware. We could also get their figures. We know that just under 65 ransoms were being paid per day per server. The average ransom was $300. We identified 147 servers. Multiply that together, this particular gang was making $34 million per year in revenue. So this is a very, very large and well-funded organization. That's $34 million that can be reinvested in making more effective pieces of malware and also more effective networks that are more resistant to being taken down. We're seeing some interesting evolution in ransomware. In March of this year, we saw a new gang enter the ransomware market, SamSam. They have a very, very different way of operating. They actually scan the internet for vulnerable devices that are running outdated versions of JBoss. When they find it, they exploit it, install a web shell on those externally facing machines, and use that to get inside the network of the organization that they compromised, look for key business servers, so servers rather than endpoints, and encrypt that and demand payment. Their ransom note, they're doing over blog comments, which is very unusual that we don't see elsewhere. Also, they offer multi-buys in the same way that you go to a supermarket and you get buy two for the price of one. We get the same thing in ransomware, buy 20 keys for the price of 15. But each time you ask for a separate key, that price goes up and goes up little by little. So actually they're developing a new business model for getting money out of their end users, which I think is quite innovative and quite new, and I'm also fairly certain that we're going to see more of over the years to come. They're looking for a fairly old set of vulnerabilities on the internet. I think the oldest dates from 2010 and the youngest from 2012. When we've gone out to search for those vulnerabilities, we've actually identified 3.2 million vulnerable machines over the internet. 2,100 of those had already been compromised, but the bad guys just hadn't got round to encrypting it. So, even the bad guys have quite a backlog of work that they've got to get round. Very interesting, a very new model. The particular ransom itself, when we first saw it, we hadn't seen it before, but we could still identify that it was malware based on its behavior, so that heuristic detection of looking at what ransoms look like, or ransomware looks like, is actually quite effective. But it's a new way of distributing malware, and I think this is definitely one that we're going to see more of in the time to come. So very, very briefly, because I know that I'm running out of time, ransomware has a whole life cycle. If you think about what you actually need to be successful for ransomware, Well, you either need to distribute your ransom over spam, or you need to distribute it over exploit kit domains. You're going to need to have some kind of malicious infrastructure in there. You have to get your payload onto the endpoint, and that payload has to get its key that it's going to use to encrypt the files from some sort of malicious infrastructure. All of these points within the life cycle can be disrupted. And indeed, in all of these points, we can put in protection in order to disrupt the ransomware so that, one, we stop it getting in front of your end users so that no one's going to be tempted to click that link because it's an email that looks like they're one that they're expecting. Also, I think one of the key things which is often forgotten about is to prepare for the day that it does happen to you, because sooner or later it will. We should also think about that magic kryptonite that defeats ransomware, good old-fashioned backups. If you actually back up your data, then you are resistant to ransomware because you can just restore. Very interestingly, one of my friends who's a consultant was brought into an organization that had been hit by ransomware, but it was okay because they'd taken backups and they had a whole backup regime where they had a different tape for every day of the week. And on Monday, they take the Monday tape, put it in their backup device, press the button in the morning, take it out, put it in the fire safe, get Tuesday's tape, put it in. Proper way of doing backups. When it came to the day that they were actually hit by ransomware, they discovered that they hadn't actually taken a backup in 3 years. So every night, they were going through the ritual of swapping the tapes and pressing the button. Hadn't worked in 3 years. So even if you think that you are taking backups, a backup isn't a backup until you've actually tested restoring from it. But it's fair to say, ransomware is not the end of the world. It's definitely one of the major ways that the bad guys are looking to make money at the moment. You need to be aware of it. It is something that we can defeat. And this is entirely the type of thing that we do within the Talos organization. So I would encourage you to go and visit our website, read our blog, where we publish the research work that we do, or indeed follow us on Twitter and keep up to date with our research. And with that, I shall thank you very much indeed. Thank you.